Welcome to Why I Left, a podcast exploring life-changing career moves. I'm your host, Brian Akar. Join me as I chronicle real stories from real people about the bold decisions that transform their careers and lives. Let's dive in. Hello, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of Why I Left. Today, we're diving into a profound and often overlooked aspect of change: grief. Transitions, whether professional or personal, come with their own set of challenges. And our guest today is someone who's made it her mission to help others navigate these moments with courage, clarity, and trust. Lori Eberly is the founder of Radius Executive Coaching and Development. Through her journey from hospice social worker to leadership coaching, she's taught countless people how to overcome obstacles, rebuild trust, and move forward with intention. Plus, she's also the co-author of Fuckery, a bold and transformative guide to identifying and eliminating the habits that damage trust in the workplace. You won't want to miss this enlightening conversation, so let's go check it out. All right, welcome back. So our guest today is Lori Eberly, founder of Radius ECD, a woman-owned business that specializes in coaching, leadership development, and cultural transformation. With over a decade of experience as a hospice social worker, Lori witnessed firsthand the transformative power of presence and truth-telling during life's most difficult moments. And it's these lessons that became the foundation for her work in guiding individuals and teams through times of change. And she is also the co-author of the book Fuckery, which I love, and which provides practical tools and insights to build trust, strengthen collaboration, and eliminate the toxic habits that undermine success. Her approach, rooted in neuroscience, emotional intelligence, and trauma-informed practices, has made her a sought-after speaker, coach, and facilitator across industries like tech, healthcare, and construction. So whether you're navigating your next career step, or you're leading a team through uncertainty, or simply just looking for inspiration to transform your own work life, Lori brings a wealth of wisdom and humor to the table. So Lori, welcome to Why I Left. How you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great today, Brian. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so before we really kind of get into this, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about, your background. So what's been your journey to, becoming a licensed clinical social worker, and then really what inspired you to pursue a career in hospice care and leadership development?
Well, I'm one of those maybe odd ducks who knows early on what I want to do. My father is also a social worker, which he went back to later in life to get his master's. And I knew while I was in high school that I was going to go to college and I was going to get a social work degree. I didn't know what sort of arm of social work I would do, but that was always the plan. And then it was during my senior or undergrad placement that I was placed in a hospice back in Canton, Ohio. And, it's always a bit of a draw, whether you're going to have a good internship and whether you're going to have a solid supervisor. And I had both. And I was 21 years old when I fell into the work that I thought this is my life's work. I think you'll find that a lot of people that work in hospice will call it a calling. And so that was back in 1995, then moved out to Oregon, where you had to have a master's in order to practice. That was not the case at the time back in Ohio. Went back to grad school, couldn't find a hospice job right out of grad school. So finally landed in hospice, which I love the intimacy of it. I love being in people's homes where there's so much more of their own power as compared to being in a hospital or a clinic setting, where you can so quickly learn about people in a way that you can't in a sterile institutional environment, right? That I could come into your home, Brian, and look around and be like, oh, I see that you were in the service. Oh, I see that you collect stamps. Oh, I see that you clearly have a love for the outdoors. And so it really allows that sense of person to emerge. And there's a universality to it, right? Like, we're not going to escape death. And so I really find it an honor to be with patients and families at that point in time. And then, of course, my career in leadership development was never on the 5-year plan. That's what emerged when I left my first hospice job. And I'm sure we'll get into that more later, but there was tremendous loss and grief surrounding that context. And I didn't know what I was going to do. And as it often is, it was someone that I knew who said, hey, I see you have a capacity to facilitate meetings and to connect with people at an emotional level. Let me tell you about executive coaching. And then that's how I made it into leadership development now 11 years ago.
Wow, that's amazing. And, as you're sitting there talking about your work in the hospice space, it's like you're with, to your point around, obviously none of us are escaping death, right? Yeah. But you're with people at these very vulnerable moments in their lives. Some of them may or may not have all their faculties there, right? So I would imagine there's this level of empathy that you bring into this space when supporting these folks. And as I was doing my background on, your how has your personal background and your heritage really shaped your approach to building trust? Because I would imagine you'd have to do that in that space. But how do you build that trust and foster those connections in your work there and overall? Like how has your background really helped shape your approach?
I appreciate the invitation to pause and consider that, right? Because we all have a different background that leads us to whatever our current place is. And as I said, my father's a social worker. So he is a pretty introverted fellow, one of those quiet, thoughtful types, very steady, very attentive. And, I recently was telling my teenage kids when I got busted for lying about where I was going and sneaking off to a party and I got busted because, teenagers or many of us are terrible liars. And I was grounded. But the other part that I needed to do was I needed to write a paper on how to make wise decisions. So that's a little bit about my father, right? And then my mother is the epitome of the good host and putting people at ease and wanting you to feel special. And she's just deeply attuned. So, when you have two caregivers, they may not be parents, right? Of course, many of us are raised by aunties and grandparents and the village. But when you have that steady, secure attachment and you have a foundation of trust, then it sure makes it a lot easier to establish trusting relationships down the road. And so I think it is a combination of that nature and nurture. And, we put our 10,000 hours in to get good at something. And I have my 10,000 hours in of knocking on a door to introduce myself as the hospice social worker. I have no idea who's on the other side of that door. I don't know what's going on in that household, but I know that I have 45 to 60 minutes to complete an assessment, to quickly establish rapport, to be able to identify their needs and goals. And when you do that over a long period of time, hopefully you get good at it.
Oh, I love that. Can I ask you a quick follow-up? Like how did you mentally prepare to walk into a space like that? I'm very curious, like knocking on doors, hospice, what that means, obviously, right? And so how did you mentally prepare yourself for what could have been?
I don't know my practice in the early days, but I can tell you that about 20 years ago, I saw sort of an icon in the hospice world, Frank Oskazeski, who runs a Buddhist hospice down in San Francisco. I saw him at a conference and he talked about, there are inpatient hospices, but I drive around to people's homes or care facilities, right? So I spend a lot of time in my car. And so if I am pulling up outside the Johnson residence, I am not just turning off my keys and hopping out of the car and running in. One, I'm reviewing whose houses am I going into, what is their diagnosis, who are their caregivers, so that when Smiling Face, opens the door, I can greet them by name, right? Are there big dogs I need to be worried about, right? So I'm getting this demographic information. But then his counsel, which has become habit, is, and again, this is a very trauma-informed approach. If I'm coming from another visit, then I'm carrying with me the experience, the joy, the pain, the struggle, the trauma, the reality of that last patient. And I don't want to walk into somebody else's home carrying that with me, right? It might sound extreme, but I really believe that that can be violence, that can be insensitive, that is disrespectful. That when I walk into your home, Brian, I want to show up as absolutely present as I can. And so Frank talks about the metaphor of when you walk through that threshold, that you are leaving that last patient behind. You are leaving the quarrel you had with somebody in your house behind. You are leaving the frustration of the traffic to get across town behind. And I am going in ready to be here and to give you all of my focus and attention. And it is that compassionate presence and active listening that even when folks are living with terminal illness and I can't fix that, that to be able to walk in, offer my highly regulated nervous system that is attentive and attuned and empathic, that's where the healing and the regulation and the feeling seen really occur. That's the magic, so to speak.
I appreciate that. And so quick transition now, we talk about here career transitions. Yep. And so, started off talking about, you moving from hospice to now founding Radius, yep. Right? This is a significant pivot, right? We've talked about some definite connections there, but ultimately, why did you leave that space in hospice care to found this new company? And really what motivated that change?
Pain, Brian, motivated that change, which is why a lot of us are motivated for change, right? So my why I left story was a controlling, micromanaging, highly dysregulated, anxious supervisor. I had been working at a large hospital-based nonprofit hospice for about 8 years. It had taken me quite a while to get there. I had an exceptional group of colleagues, of nurses and chaplains and volunteer coordinators, bath aides that I had worked with for many years, where an incredible amount of trust had been developed, like these kind of people where you finish each other's sentences. And where you say, you know what, we've got active addiction in the home and we need to go have a hard conversation about who's dipping into the narcotics. I'm going out with the nurse. These aren't pleasant conversations. And we can walk into anywhere and know that we have each other's backs and that we're going to be really effective at what we do, right? So I was at that place that I think a lot of folks maybe never reach in their careers, right? Of loving the work, loving your colleagues, loving your boss. Like it's just really all aligning. But I was part of a mass exodus of dozens of hospice employees who left under her reign. And I had no idea what I was going to do next, because this was like the life work. And it followed what I would say was probably a good 6 to 9 months of, now looking back, clinical depression, because there was an incredible sense of loss. I'd worked so hard to get here. I can't believe that the only way to improve this situation is going to be to leave. And I was incredibly resentful about that. At some point, because it became unbearable, and I had small children at the time, I was carrying our health insurance, right? Which is why we know a lot of people don't leave. I stuck it out long past when I should have because of that health insurance. What really helped me, and I advise people to do this now, is I set a date. I picked November 13th because that's my birthday. And I said, if things don't improve by November 13th, and that was probably 3 months out at the time, then I will be giving my notice. And they didn't improve. And when we have that fixed date and we're surrounded by uncertainty, it can really help us know like there is an end. And it also meant that I, quit buying those $5 lattes and I started squirreling away more money. And I created my escape plan. And that's how I did it. And then I left in November. And pretty soon after, it was someone that I was on a nonprofit board with that said, hey, let's have lunch. I'd love you to come work with me. And I'm like, so I'm an end-of-life social worker. My entire background is in healthcare. You do something in corporate. You do something in the semiconductor industry. What in the world would I do for you? And right. This is where he said, you're good with people. And I'm like, well, I am good with people, but like, I don't see how these two meet. And he brought me into his very established company, was an incredible mentor to me, taught me a lot about hiring for potential, hiring for something you see and not necessarily what you see on the resume, which, since this is a job post podcast, way too many people get stuck on, oh, you went to MIT. Oh, you've done this for 10 years, like, et cetera. He hired for potential, taught me what I needed to know. Some of my first work was getting on a plane, fly into Austria to coach physicists and engineers on how to manage their teams. I mean, I literally, Brian, had no idea what I was effing doing. Talk about like making shit up. I don't know if I can say that, but that's what I was doing.
Okay,
that's how I fell into it. So, when other people like want to get into a career coaching, I will say, well, do you have a really well-connected, wealthy white guy who can start your job for you? Because that's how I got into this. And I'm keenly aware of how I got my start.
Got it. And, you mentioned something too that has often popped up on the show around grieving the loss of a job, right?
Oh,
and we've talked about that very openly, and kind of leads into my next question around like, what was the most challenging part of that transition? And if you could talk a little bit about that grieving, that loss piece that you mentioned.
So grieving the loss of a promotion, of a job not being what you thought you were walking into, of a job becoming something that you no longer enjoy, are all examples of disenfranchised loss, right? Like when you say the word grief, we tend to think about the death of a human being. And I got a lot of experience about that. But job loss, divorce, miscarriage, pet death are all examples of disenfranchised grief, meaning you don't get to go into your boss and say, I'm struggling with my kiddo going off to college. I want to access 3 days of my paid bereavement leave. Most people don't have that employer, right? So I think with job loss, there's moments where it's deeply acute. Like, for example, if you are laid off, if your job is terminated, if you interviewed for a promotion within the same company and you got passed over, that's going to be an acute loss. You understand why you're feeling that grief. But there's also the losses of, I really wanted to be the lead on that project and I didn't have the opportunity to. I had opportunity to be mentored by the CFO, which is big win for me, but it didn't turn out the way I wanted it to. He was always canceling on me. All he wanted to do was talk about himself. There is the loss of, I've been exceptional at my job. I've, climbed the ladder. I am at the pinnacle of my career and I'm bored. Or there was a change in the founder and I don't like it around here anymore. There was a merger and we totally lost the culture. I work with a lot of folks in startup community, right? You were like the third hire. There were 5 of us. There were 10 of us. And now there's 100 of us. And that's really exciting. And there's all sorts of wins around, but I really miss it when we were working out of the garage. I really missed it when I was the one like literally changing the toilet paper in the bathroom. And it is those unspoken losses that begin to nag at us and create dis-ease in our bodies, that create that restlessness around, why don't I hop out of bed to go to this job, the way that I used to? We certainly saw the impact of COVID on the loss of, maybe I was always showing up at the office and now I'm a remote team. Maybe I got a promotion, but it means that I now have regional teams and I don't see people on a regular basis, right? So there's so many ways that loss impacts us in our careers and we have so little language to talk about it.
No, it's so true. And you talked earlier about how, the work in hospice really kind of honed these skills and your approach to leadership and org development. As you reflect on your career so far, what is one key lesson that you've learned about navigating transitions, whether it's professional or even personal?
I always feel a little pinned against the wall when I get a, what's your favorite or what's the one thing? Because I tend to be a much more expansive speaker, as you can probably tell. Of course, transitions are very unique. Time and context are so relevant. I think when we're going through transitions, whether they're acute, sudden transitions or kind of long and drawn out, that there's a lot of power in what Dan Siegel calls name it to tame it. And that is, this is a, neurobiological suggestion, is that when we're going through transition and loss, this is change, right? Sometimes it's welcome change, sometimes it isn't. but it can be dysregulating. It can send us into a survival state, right? Which a lot of us know as fight, flight, and freeze. And part of what happens there is our executive functioning goes offline, which is why we can feel either, really overwhelmed or really, paralyzed in that analysis paralysis. So when we can pause and name it, it requires us to find a word, which puts us back in our prefrontal cortex, right? So for me to say, I am really tired because work just isn't feeding me like it used to. I am really resentful because I am exhausted with the favoritism going on around here. I am really torn because I still really enjoy my job, but I've got a 3-year-old, or I've got to care for a parent, or my personal relationship is on the rocks and I'm feeling really torn about how I do both of these things, right? So can we practice naming it, which doesn't fix it, but helps to regulate our nervous system? And so it's the naming, not even just the emotion, because that's kind of tricky for a lot of us, but it's even naming, I am not sleeping well. I feel a sense of dread when I wake up in the morning. I am so bored. If I have to sit through another ops review, I'm going to poke my eyes out, right? It's learning to name what our interior experience is like. And then what I also help clients with is then what is that somatic experience? When I go to work, I have a pit in my stomach. I have a Todd-induced headache that every time I see he's in the Slack or on the Zoom call, the headache shows up because I know that some BS is about to ensue, right? So can we begin to name what the loss, what the transition, what the impact is on our psyche and on our body?
That makes a lot of sense. Okay. We'd love to talk a little bit more about Radius, right? And so what led you to start Radius, and how does it reflect your vision for helping teams and leaders truly thrive?
Well, again, it wasn't the 10-year plan to found a leadership and development company. It just sort of came into being. It doesn't mean I didn't work hard for it, but it was not the long-term strategy. I freelanced for 3 or 4 years with that first mentor who brought me into the fold and taught me about what this organizational and leadership development was. And that work was exclusively the semiconductor industry and the tech industry, which was really different than working in healthcare and hospice. For one thing, there's a whole lot more men that are doing that work than are working as end-of-life caregivers, it turns out. So while I loved the pace of that, I loved the global travel, I loved the diversity of like racial and ethnic backgrounds of the clients that I worked, also turns out that a lot of the people at the top of tech companies kind of look the same, Brian. And while I really enjoyed working with those engineers and physicists, I really missed working with women because that's who tends to lead a lot of the nonprofit organizations. And I also was working almost exclusively out of Silicon Valley and Europe and Asia. And I wanted to have clients here in Portland. I wanted to have clients that I could meet for coffee, that I could go on a walk with. I have folks that I could entertain at my home. And so I began developing clients in that nonprofit space, in women in leadership spaces. And for many years, that really complemented my like large corporate tech work. Started working with local tech nonprofit or startups and small businesses. And so have just really enjoyed that diversification of the big companies and then the small businesses and the nonprofits where we can affect and impact change in really different ways, right? And like over these 11 years, Radius has changed because I've changed, and it's remained largely a solo project. I regularly bring in collaborators if I get a contract that is, much larger than me. If somebody has an area of expertise that is beyond mine, I know what my lane is. I know when I'm providing a counsel and when somebody else can do it better than me, right? So it's grown, it's morphed. Sometimes it's largely executive coaching. Sometimes it's a lot more organizational development development. I love to do 360 reviews and, go in and learn what it's like to work with Brian and interview folks that work above you, folks that work with you, and folks that report to you, and wrap it all up in a bow and be like, so Brian, this is what we learned. Let's use this as the compass in your development plan. I love doing that. Some years I'm doing loads of public speaking, doing a lot of Fuckery workshops. The book has certainly been good for, the credentials, for wrapping up all that you've learned in a career and helping people to have something to take away, right? So that's sort of where Radius has grown, and there's just a ton of flexibility and autonomy in that. There's also a shortage of retirement plans and health insurance, turns out, but it's been a real joy to run that business and work with the people all over the world and across industries. So grateful for that.
No, that's awesome. And would love to, just expand a little bit on your approach. And I teed it up earlier around how you really integrate neuroscience and emotional intelligence and trauma-informed care in the work that you do. How did these elements come together to achieve lasting behavioral change?
The shortest answer to that question is I'm a good listener. And there's a shortage of good listeners in this world. And we're lucky if we have good listeners in our personal life, with the people that we live with or the people that we hang out with on the weekend and the evenings. There's often not that experience at work where we're talking over each other, where we're constantly interrupting, where, trying to show off who has the best answer, who can outsmart who, right? And so being a patient, deep listener is foundational for being a good therapist, hospice social worker, or executive coach and leader, right? I have to be able to ask good questions, which is something you're very good at, Brian. I have to be curious. I bring somebody recently referred to me as having fierce curiosity. And I was like, oh, I love that. Thank you very much for that compliment. That the best leaders are wildly curious. They do not have all the information. This is where I really dig into, I am a coach, not a consultant. In my mind, consultants have a quick assessment of the problem and then they tell. I am not going to dare to tell someone how to be a better VP of engineering because I have no idea. I am not going to tell a founder at what rate to grow at, right? I am going to, through my questions, through my listening, through my reflecting and mirroring and shared observations, help lead you to your own answers. Because that also means that when things don't go the way you hoped, I'm not the one to blame. And it's not that I'm trying to skirt accountability. It's just that smart people don't like to be told what to do. None of us like to be told what to do. And so I really like to be that mirror and that guide. And again, to the pausing before the threshold. It's incredibly intimate work to be a guide, to be a mentor, to be a coach, to be someone's supervisor and have a one-on-one with them, hopefully 1 to 2 times a month, right? That is incredible intimacy. And are we able to show up thoughtfully, not distracted? I mean, sidebar, but Brian, I know so many people who have a one-on-one, and while they're in their one-on-one, their boss is on Slack. Their boss is looking over here at a computer and they're just saying, yeah, tell me, Lori, about that thing that you're doing. And when is, the deliverable, and have you talked to supply chain? No, that is not a one-on-one. Can we show up and do one thing at a time? And can I not bring what happened in that last meeting into this conversation that I'm having with my colleague, with my customer? That is emotional regulation. That is self-awareness. And we have to first learn to manage the self before we can effectively manage others.
I love that. And earlier, you talked a little bit about, which I loved and appreciated, the grief of losing a job, right? Yeah. And how you experienced that and how you overcame that. It's one of these things that's often under-recognized when we talk about career transitions. Now, in your coaching space, how do you help individuals then process this type of grief and move forward with a newfound clarity and purpose in whatever it is that they're looking to do next?
I think this goes back to my former answer of we name it to tame it. That a lot of people are hiring me because they're getting ready to leave a job and they want to figure out their next steps, or they're doing a significant pivot and they've been working in X industry for a while and they do the next thing, right? And so people come, or, they've just been promoted and they want to know how to manage a bigger team or a remote team, et cetera. And so they often bring very much a like future orientation. They want to talk about here's current situation and here's desired situation. And my approach of helping to clarify goals, helping to see where their resource and what their needs are, also includes questions and introspection around, and what are we leaving? Why did we leave, right? I mean, I'm doing that in an individual investigative reason. And when I hear stories of loss, and there are always stories of loss, I don't gloss over them. And the longer I do this, the greater the pause and attention to what we're leaving behind, right? Maybe it's, well, tell me at the height of that role, what were you loving about it? And then tell me about what's not working for you anymore. Tell me at that last company when you were laid off, name that grief for me. You lost a job, but what else did you lose? And depending on the person, they have the internal capacity to, have language for that, to go deep into it. And some of us have decades of history of compartmentalizing, of repressing, of avoiding, of numbing, right? And we don't want to look in the rearview mirror. What doesn't get acknowledged stays with us, and it comes out somewhere. And a lot of us, if we're working for someone who is dysregulated, who does not know how to show up for us, who is engaging in lots of trust damaging habits, there is grief, there is trauma, there is dysregulation there that is not being tended. So we can't do anything about your colleague or your boss, but we can talk about that. And it doesn't have to be, like for the next 3 sessions. Sometimes it is naming it. Sometimes it is the process of naming it and having someone witness it. I didn't change it, but I felt it with you. And I acknowledge, wow, Brian, that must have really been a disappointment. Brian, I see that you really have a spark when you talked about being able to design new products and to listen deeply to what your customers need. And now that you've lost that customer interface, you are so bored and you thought you could do it for a while, but it's just not scratching the itch for you anymore. Right? One of the goals is I want clients to be like, oh, yeah, she gets it. Because many of us know what that feeling is like. Oh, that person gets me, right? And we too often avoid that grief, don't even recognize we have that grief. And so it is the naming, and sometimes it's some grief rituals. We're going to write that stuff down, and we're going to light a candle and burn it in a little bowl before I send you off, right? I'm going to be like, I want you to journal this. We're not going to spend our time doing this today, but I've heard you say these are 5 areas of grief and loss you experienced in that last job. My challenge to you is to go home and spend 15 minutes writing more about this. Maybe you talk to a friend or a mentor or a therapist or someone about this so that you're not holding it on your own, and that we can then bring this grief back to our next sessions, because we're not going forward without integrating the losses that you have and are experiencing.
That's a great point. Great point. It reminds me of a conversation I had with a counselor in season 2 that talked about oftentimes when we think about grief, it's like, okay, we grieve and then people think we're just done. Right. But no, you grieve and it becomes, to your point, it's like, it becomes a part of us, right? That we never forget about the grief. We understand it. We just have a better way of, I guess, for lack of a better word, managing as we continue to move forward in life. And so I love the connection you're making with what she said a couple of seasons ago. So I appreciate that. Yeah. Now let's talk about the book. So your book, I love it. Your book, Fuckery, tackles trust damaging habits in the workplace. So I'm sure a lot of people can attest to either, I don't know if they would attest to doing those things themselves, but maybe having those things done to them, right? But that's just a guess on my end.
Yeah, well, you're very intuitive, Brian. It's a lot easier to name what's going on around us and talk about the fuckery of our boss or our colleagues than it is to hold up that mirror and be like, oh, yeah.
Absolutely. So can you maybe share the story behind writing it and really why you felt it was a conversation that needed to happen?
Yeah, so the book published in 2016, and I believe that my co-author, John Sable, and I took about 2 years to write it. And John had began as a client. He is a mechanical engineer, worked for a laser company here in town, and I was coaching 3 of his direct reports. And monthly, John and I would have dinner as part of the accountability so that he could learn what I was doing with his folks that were working for him. And John and I got each other, and we're kind of like a yin and yang. So it wasn't sort of like an obvious match. And there's just a lot of like going toe to toe. And I really prefer to be direct and candid. And Portland is known to be a very passive aggressive, conflict avoidant town. And so John also like shoots from the hip. And so we had this kind of fast camaraderie and understanding of each other. And after we'd worked for a couple of years, and John actually was no longer at the company, and we had like one of our last dinners to talk about the work that we shared. And then a couple of weeks maybe after that, he texted me, I have an idea. And like when John Sable has an idea, you want to know what it is. And if you get to be involved, then like you're saying yes before you're even aware of what it is. And he texted back, I want to write a book. We'd never discussed this. You know, maybe it was something I wanted to do. I never thought it would be with John Sable. And I'm like, yes. And we had no idea, Brian, where we were going with this book, right? And this is where I highly recommend that if you don't have someone in your professional life or period, just your life, right, that brings the best out in you, that thinks there's nothing more fun than showing up at a whiteboard and tossing out ideas, right? That's what John and I did for a while. Like basically I would ask him questions like, John, you always told me that you really didn't care what was on the resume, that you hire for hunger. What does hunger look like, right? And so John would write about that. And we sort of gave each other writing assignments, Brian. And then after we had a lot of those, we came to see that this hospice social worker turned coach and this mechanical engineer turned senior tech leader had some complementary and really interesting overlap in the way that we led. And at one point, I think it was like, I realized that in all the 360 interviews that I've done and asked people, all right, you've worked with Brian for a long time. What are Brian's strengths? What are the 1 or 2 things that are the primary reason Brian gets in his own way? And what are 1 or 2 things that Brian can focus on so that 6 months from now, he's a more effective leader, right? I've asked those questions dozens of times. And that people rarely say, Brian needs to, take some classes on, this content area. It is almost always, Brian needs to quit interrupting people. Brian needs to learn to speak up. Brian needs to quit playing favorites. Brian needs to stop micromanaging. It came back to a behavior. And so John and I sort of noodled on this. So it was a very sort of scientific approach in what got us started. And then we wrote the book, Brian, in Google Docs. And maybe other authors would be like, you take chapter 1 on this subject, I'll take chapter 2 on this subject, and then we'll like edit. We got to a place where we were literally showing up in Google Docs and editing each other's paragraphs as they were being written, right? So I'm like, yesterday I met with Charles and we were talking about blah, blah, blah. And while I'm typing, John is changing the tense of my word met and he's adding adjectives. And of course, that would probably be crazy making for a lot of people. But there was this incredible level of intimacy to writing a book like, and it has really been the foundation for the most popular workshop that I do, right? Which is, depending on the office, it is either the fuckery factor or because lots of places don't allow you to use the F-bomb in the workshops that they promote at work, it is things like improving your self-awareness, building trust on your team, right? Which I can certainly adapt to that, but we wanted it to be congruent. Because if you can't say the word, then you're going to have a hard time acknowledging and naming and working through the way that this wreaks havoc on your relationships, on your trust, on your willingness to work with people, and on the success of your teams and organizations.
I love that. And that the framework that you talk about, it really emphasizes, to your point, it's like radical accountability and self-awareness, which I think is huge. And Also, when I think about EQ, that foundational piece really starts with self-awareness.
Yeah.
So thinking about that, what are some common fuckery habits leaders unknowingly perpetuate, and how can they start addressing them?
Very important. Again, back to name it to tame it. It's
Mhm.
much easier to name what's going on around us. And I actually love to play a little game called Name That Fuckery. And I do this in workshops where they're like, Lori, I don't know what this call is called, but I have a habit of where my, Bob in, finance keeps doing this. What are we going to call that? Like, I had a client who helped me identify Chicken Littling. And I might be dating myself here, but I don't know if you know the like sort of old folk tale about Chicken Little. And Chicken Little says, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. And that means you are always making a crisis out of everything. This is the opposite of the steady Eddie, right? That's fuckery. If everything is an emergency, then nothing is an emergency, right?
Nothing.
So
Right.
when I do workshops, I pass out what has become affectionately known as the fuckery deck, because it's a really good conversation starter. So you might be sitting at a table that says ageism, manipulating, unyielding, sexual harassment, blackmail, extortion. And what we say there, because they have an asterisk, is John and I, when we wrote the book, we were like, well, that's kind of the go to hell pile. Like, if you've got sexual harassment going on in your team, a 90-minute workshop with Lori is not going to help that. But I've realized, because, I try to take religion out of things, it's not too much a go to hell pile as a go to jail pile, right? Mm-hmm. So there's levels of damaging trust that can happen that are beyond the scope of this book and this workshop. But of course, we don't want that. But we also want to root out playing the victim. We want to root out bullshit deadlines. Have you ever worked on a team where they're like, by the end of the week, we want to, and there's absolutely no way that that's going to happen by the end of the week, right? Not respecting other people's boundaries, lack of ownership. We walk people through how to make a fuckery map, right? On Lori's fuckery map is people pleasing, analysis paralysis, over accommodating, some of my own conflict avoidance. I like to help other people face their conflict, but doesn't mean Lori's always doing it herself. I can be patronizing. I can be really impatient and curt when I've got a deadline and I'm feeling dysregulated, right? So I have to know what my habits are before I can start taming them. And when I wrote the book, Brian, people pleasing was high right, which is what you're most likely to do, the greatest impact and the greatest frequency, right? And because I knew that wasn't working for me, because I knew I was saying yes to too many things, because I knew that I was not speaking my truth consistently, because my need to be liked was getting in the way of me holding people accountable, I got really focused on decreasing that people pleasing. And I can, with great confidence, say that over the last 8 years, that has gone from high right to low left, because I've replaced it with habits that allow me to be a more effective leader, leading a more joyous life.
Love that. It's like you're demonstrating your own self-awareness and accountability through your own work. So I love that you mentioned that. This part of the interview, I always like to get advice, and you've been dropping some gems throughout, right? Which I appreciate. For listeners who are now considering or may be considering their next career step, especially during uncertain times, which arguably now are very uncertain times, right? Or maybe not so arguably, but they are. What advice would you give to help them navigate transitions with courage and resilience?
Navigate transitions with courage and resilience. Number one, don't go it alone. It doesn't mean you have to hire a coach. I hope that folks can find one support person in their life to bounce ideas off of. I often, when folks are trying to consider what's next and it seems kind of murky, I mean, some of us, we know, I'm going to school, I'm getting this certificate, I'm looking for senior jobs in product marketing. Boom, I know what I'm going for. A lot of people aren't that focused. I have learned that it's typically easier to name what you don't want, to clear out what's in the way of finding what you do want, right? That can be, I don't want any more jobs. I've worked in education. I don't want to work in schools anymore. Okay. So it can be naming that. It can be, I've worked at, big global corporate companies. I'm tired of the bureaucracy. I want to work at a less than 500 person company. It can be, I don't want to work remote anymore, or I don't want 5 days in the office, right? So start with your list. And sometimes this can be overwhelming. So I love the timer, right? Do some speed work. Set a timer for 5 minutes, get a blank piece of paper. I'm really old school that way. Pull out your Google Docs, whatever you want to do. What are the things that are straight out no's for me, right? Then I also will say, if you're looking for a role and you're not quite sure what it is you're looking for, keep a diary, a journal of things that gets your attention. The title of that role got my attention. I've never seen it phrased that way before. I'm going down and looking at the job responsibilities. I had never framed what I do in those words, but that's exactly what I want to do. I'm going to lift that job description and I'm going to add it to my cover letter or resume. Start looking for what causes your body to move towards a role and what you are reading and you're like, oh, hell no, I will never do that again, right? Like, write that stuff down. We can't keep all of that up here, right? It is such a messy, jumbled place to be looking for work, especially if there's some loss and grief on board, because loss and grief directly impact your executive functioning. Same as not getting enough sleep or having financial insecurity and you're like not sure where you're going to be, like where that next rent or mortgage is coming from, right? So write stuff down, share that with someone, having conversation with a friend. You know what? I've been writing down titles of jobs and things that I want to do. Can I read these out loud to see how they sound? And I want you, Brian, to tell me, like, do you think I have this, or what would make me better at this, right? I really advise people to do, people will say, do the informational interviews. Don't just show up with someone and be like, hey, Brian, thanks for having coffee with me. I'm looking for a new role as an EAP counselor. Who do you know? And who can you introduce me to? No, that's a freaking lazy, needy, non-reciprocal way to have an informational interview, right? I want to show up prepared and say, Brian, I don't even know what I'm looking for yet, but we worked together 3 years at X company, and I feel like you get me. And I feel like you know what my strengths are. And I'd like to think we have the kind of relationship where you can be like, and Lori, these are some habits you might work on, right? So you're soliciting information. You're being scientific about this. You're practicing discovery and you're recording the process along the way, which can also really help you when it's been 3 months or 6 months and you still don't have that job, that you're not like, it's all been for nothing, but that you can go back and you can be like, these are all the ideas. I set a goal that I would have 3 coffee dates or walks with people every week. And I've been doing that, or I haven't been doing that. Right. I said that I wanted to reach out to 5 people that work across town at Nike. And I've talked to 10, or I've talked to 2. This also helps with the accountability, and it helps with that dopamine of I am checking some boxes, even though I haven't yet checked the box of I have a new job.
I love that. And as you think about what's next for you, what impact are you personally hoping to have in the future of all the work that you're doing?
What comes to mind is a poet whose name is escaping me right now, but she writes about, she's not looking for flashy success. She's not looking for her name in lights, but she wants to be valued like a button. Like, no one says, man, buttons are the coolest invention ever, but they're pretty damn cool, right? Like, yeah. It's not that they are like, I want to be a button, Brian. Like, I want people to feel like this conversation, this time together added value, that this time with Lori helped me feel grounded before I went back to like the constant chaos that we are living amongst, right? That despite uncertainty, despite grief, that for that 30 minutes, for that 60 minutes, I felt seen. I felt heard. That because that regulated nervous system was able to show up and be present, that I was able to be present with myself.
I love that. Absolutely. I appreciate you sharing that because, I think about that button analogy. It's like literally our holding things together, right? And so like that conversation with Lori held me together. I love that you mentioned that. I love that. So now I would love to flip the mic to you. and say and ask, well, what's one question that you have for me that I can hopefully answer?
Oh, hopefully answer. Well, we can all answer the question. Well, we can choose to answer questions, right?
True.
And we can answer them in a variety of ways. Well, our nervous systems really love choice, Brian. And so I'm going to ask you too, and you get dealer's choice. So one question to keep it on topic might be, what's your fuckery, Brian? Or you can choose to answer, because I'm deeply curious about this, who taught or modeled for you how to ask such beautiful and thoughtful questions? Because you do, and it's a skill, and not a lot of us have it.
Ooh, that's a good one. I'll take dealer's choice, but the choice is going to be both of them, because I think I appreciate both of them. I appreciate both of them so much. Let me start with fuckery. What are my fuckery habits? And these are things I've had to work through. I hopefully don't do them as much now, but in the past, so I'm very much here's an ask that comes, right? Or something that we need to do. I'm like, let's get it done. I don't procrastinate. I don't pontificate on things. It's like, okay, let's do this. I would rather go for it, fail, figure out that wasn't the right way, and then let's do something else. Not everybody's like that, right? So for me, in my earlier like leadership management days, right, we'd have a task, and the people who would be reporting to me, I would bring that same type of energy, like, okay, let's get this done. Whatever, not that everything. And because I appreciate what you mentioned earlier about everything being an emergency. For me, everything wasn't an emergency, but there were certain things. It's like, if there was an ask that it was due at some point, it's like, hey, well, let's get this done. Let's get it out of the way, right? Yeah. So it's not an emergency, but let's make this a priority.
Yeah.
And at times, I think that, I don't know if it necessarily rubbed people the wrong way, but I think it lit fires under folks that didn't necessarily need to be lit, and caused stress unknowingly on my part, right? Because I'm just like trying to move through whatever, and I would like to think that I'm a pretty even-keeled boss, right? Like I don't really gripe about much. Really, it's just like, here's what we got to do. As long as we get it done, great. But at times, I used to push a little bit, like, hey, let's work on it. Oh, we can meet on it next week. How about we do it a little earlier, right? It's just so we can kind of get the ball rolling, right?
Yes.
And so I've had to learn through that and recognize that at times my push is maybe at times unintentional. Like, of course, I want to get the things done and I want to get it done right.
Yes.
But I need to be a bit more mindful of how that is perceived.
Yes.
To others who may be reporting directly to me.
Preach. Yes, that is self-awareness in action. And our trust-damaging habits, our fuckery, is in the shadow of our strengths. It's too much of a good thing. So in corporate leadership speak, Brian, you've described that you have a bias towards action and a strong sense of urgency, right? Which are really important leadership skills. But if you're working for people whose brains don't think like that and whose nervous systems do not work at that pace, I am going to be crying in a corner working for you. Right. So it is because you have such a bias towards that action, right? Which is great in that you can get stuff done. But the overthinker over here needs you to just give me a little bit more reassurance. You don't mind if you move quickly and fail, but lots of people are really risk averse. And so we've got to be able to have a conversation about that, right? And then you, like my co-author, John Sable, who has that, he's going to push me and then I'm going to sort of slow him down. And so together, that's where you get that really powerful dynamic.
No, absolutely. So I'm glad you asked about that, because as soon as you said it, I was like, oh, I know this one. I've been working through that.
Yeah, good for you. Lifelong work.
Absolutely. And so now the second one, I don't know if it was specifically someone who taught me. I think it made like one individual. I think it was a series of things. So I am an employment attorney by trade. And in my first real legal job, one of my mentors, friends, he's truthfully like an uncle to me now, Uncle Ron, right? When I used to watch how he interacted with clients, judges, members of the public, the type of questions he used to ask, the thoughtfulness that he took to situations. I think that's something that really resonated with me throughout the time I worked with him and still to this day. But I think what I did intentionally or unintentionally is then always try to make sure then when I became, an investigator, or I was, interviewing somebody who, I'm sure you have a whole host of hospice stories. I have a whole host of investigator stories where, you're trying to get to a thing, right? And someone's coming to you with an issue, but you do need to be honest, kind of probe and prod a little bit to really get down to what's happening. You really want to be mindful of how you say things. And I'll share a quick example, and I won't get too graphic, but it's that it was a sexual harassment case where a woman was having pictures of her distributed somewhere publicly, right? And I literally had to ask her how this happened, how they met, whatever, and go through these photos. And this was this me and her one-on-one having this conversation. She just met me, for God's sakes, right? And showing me very personal photos of her because it led to here's what happened, right?
Wow.
You don't experience that personally. You can't experience that without having some form of care attached to how you're approaching her in this particular moment. But that then impacts you going forward.
Yes.
Because it's you're like, wow, of course she's coming to me. One, you're coming to me with an issue. We're trying to resolve it. Two, this issue is a very personal issue. And you're about to show this random guy these types of pictures that are out there online to try to get to this issue. It took a lot for you to step in here. Right. Yeah. And so when I think about these questions, I do my background on folks. And I really try to see hey, these are the vibes that I'm getting from them. Let's flesh this out a little bit. What could this look like? It always is helpful when you have a website, right? And so I can pick and choose where you're going from and what I wanted to talk about. So I think it was a series of, my old boss, the work that I've done and continue to do. Yeah. And then now I would then add on. So now I'm in a space where not only with the show, but with what I do day to day, I'm trying to better understand what people want to do for their future. And so I can't just say, what do you want to do in the future? Right. I want to know, I want to know more about you, right? To your point, what is it that you're interested in? Oh, healthcare. Why healthcare? What about this specific thing? Yeah. And then I learn more about you. I could craft more detailed questions for you. But then in another spaces, I can then point you in the right direction. And so I love those two questions because, so I think that's where I kind of go with it.
Oh, well, Brian, you might not be able to specifically name a person, but for all of your listeners who have been maybe appreciating your show and had not quite pinned down that was one element of what they liked about you, they can go back and listen to your podcast and realize that you have an art and a craft and a knack for asking open-ended, curious, personal questions that light up your guests, help them feel safe, and your ability to layer them and to bring a true, sincere curiosity about what the answers will be is a gift that we can all learn from.
Wow. I really appreciate that. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And look, and thank you for coming on the show. This was a great conversation. Got to give a huge shout out to Sandra Hunter, who connected us. I think learning about your story. I think when we met in the intro, I was like, you had me at Fuckery, and I just wanted to make sure you wanted to come on the show. So everything else was a formality, but I was like, hey, I got to hear more about this. And so thank you so much for coming on. Where can our listeners support you and find out more about the work that you're doing? And of course, read up on the book.
Well, you can find me online. My website is radiusecd as in development.com. And there you can find the appendix of all the different fuckery habits. So you don't even need to buy the book, which is available on Amazon, to see like, what are my bad habits, right? So you can find me there. I'm on LinkedIn. I had been very active on Instagram, but part of my New Year's resolution was to spend less time on social media. So I've recently deleted that account. I'm open to people's emails. If anyone wants to contact me directly, you'll find the ability to do that online.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And look, that'll do it for today's episode. I want to again thank Lori Eberly for joining me today. Hope you all picked up some key nuggets throughout our conversation, which I definitely did myself. I will share all of her information in our show notes, and I hope you all have a great week, and we'll definitely see you next time. Lori, thank you so much. Thanks for listening to Why I Left. Join us next time for more inspiring stories about growth, resilience, and transformation. Visit us online at www.whyileft.co. That's whyileft.co. And subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the Alive Podcast Network. See you soon.